Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and I'm outdoors today. So it's a nice day. It's a little chillier, or it's a little cooler out, not quite as humid. And we are continuing with our series on the formation of the deep state. We've just concluded the chapter 20 uh, and talked about the United States entry into the war, World War II. And so I want to take a time out here to look back at how we got where we are and go through the different dispensations of these power elites, how they came from this post-Civil War corporatist to the modern day deep state as we know it today. So I think World War II is the line of demarcation where they become deep state as we now understand what the deep state is. So I think World War II is a really good, a really important time frame to focus on because it changed going from World War II on. It changed. And we're setting the table for what comes next, which is a story of treason that most Americans know nothing about. It's not in the history books. It wasn't written about in real time by the news media, at least not with any credibility. Um, and it was just kept very, very quiet, but it was very, very real. And it's very instructive to know who was behind it, who was pulling the strings, what their methods were, because it's going to happen again. And just because this one happened to fail doesn't mean the conspirators, which it was multiple people, so it was a conspiracy, didn't take notes and realize just how uh, close they came to succeeding. And if you just change a couple things, you could succeed the next time. What the motives were, et cetera, et cetera. That'll be the focus of this is chapter 21 today, so that'll be the focus of chapters 22 and 23. But today we want to look at the metamorphosis of this process that takes place, whereby these corporate owners, these robber barons, these captains of industry, on the outside looking in when it comes to politics and government, when they first started, become the government by the time we get to the end of the World War II. And I want to look especially at two very progressive presidents, Woodrow Wilson and FDR, and how uh, on its face, you would think as a progressive, they would be against the power elites, these corporatists, these owners, these power elites running everything. That's an anathema to everything they stand for. And yet, and domestically, they legislated that way. They governed that way. But as far as the foreign empire was concerned, both of our two most progressive presidents we ever had gave the power elites everything they wanted as far as foreign territory and foreign interventions and this imperialist direction that we were going. So it's ironic, is what it is. So we'll look at those two things today and the rise of these corporatists. You know, when we looked at the beginning of this movement after the Civil War ended, it coincided with the rise of corporations. And you had these industrialists who uh, invested in the machines and the factories and and they started to become fabulously wealthy. And as their corporations got bigger and bigger, they got more and more power. Obviously, they had economic power, but they also had political power because they could contribute campaign donations to all the politicians. And one of the things that made them so powerful and so wealthy was the Ultra Vires doctrine, which got codified into law. And if you don't know what Ultra Vires is by now, you have been paying much attention because I've just hit it on every episode. Ultra Vires is the doctrine that mandates that everybody involved in the corporation operate under one uh, objective, and that is to maximize profits. They don't worry about the public interest. It's about maximizing profits. In fact, you could be fired if it was found that you were operating, making decisions, or even considering the public interest. And then you immunize yourself, you immunize your company, your corporation, from any liability. You hide all your assets and subsidiaries, and you immunize yourself from tax liability by hiding all your income in holding companies or shell companies. So immunity goes hand in hand with the maximization of these profits. So it did what you would think it would do. It made these 50 or 60 individuals who owned all these biggest corporations in America fabulously wealthy and fabulously powerful. In a counteract to that, we saw the rise of the progressive movement. Uh, it was originally known as the Chautauqua movement. It happened in Lake Chautauqua in New York, and that was the counteract. So coming out of this era, we have a tug and war between the progressives and these captains of industry slash robber barons, whatever you want to call them, the rise of corporations, and uh, the both sides would have their moments of victory and things of that nature, but eventually the American people are going to weigh in and take a side in the form of an election. These power elites in the next era, which is the age of imperialism, decided that in order to continue to grow, remember that's part of the definition of capitalism. You have a company, you have an industry, it has to do better the next year. Every year it has to do better, has to get bigger, has to make more money. Okay, it can't stay static, it can't stay the same. It must continually be growing. So in their quest to continually grow, these power elites decide we need an overseas empire. We've run out. We've used up all our territory here at home. Plus, there are resources to be had in these faraway lands, cheap resources, uh, raw materials, and we need those. We talked about sugar cane, for example, in Hawaii and Cuba, but there were others, lots of others. And then we need more customers, which means we need export markets. And we need the territory, obviously, for the resources, but also for the military bases, because the military is going to be the hammer. No one's going to willingly allow us to come in and colonize that. We need a hammer. We need a military base in that part of the world where we're going to create these spheres of influence. And of course, this was all undergirded by this philosophy of social Darwinism. If it's not us, it's going to be somebody else. Might as well be us. And if you're not targeting somebody else for colonization, somebody else is targeting you for colonization. So the power elites began setting out to create this overseas empire. And this is when you start to see the private sector, ultra vires, influencing the public sector. And it came through money, the contributions to these political campaigns. And so you start to see efforts. For example, Hawaii. Oh, you know, it was the sugar companies that went to the government and said, you need to send the Marines in to overthrow Queen Lily so we can get our hands on that sugar cane. And so the U.S. government did the bidding of the private sector sugarcane companies in that case because they were on the hook. They'd been all these politicians that are making these decisions depended on the private sector donations to run their campaigns. So they were bought and paid for. So you start to see this bleeding over taking place where private sector ultra vires is now influencing the public sector through money. Uh, and in the course of this imperialist age, it was determined that some of the territories that we really wanted to get our hands on, namely Cuba, we were going to have to go through Spain to get our hands on Cuba because it was a Spanish colony. So we decided to concoct and gin up a foreign war, our first foreign war. But we got to get the support of the American people. The American people have been traditionally very resistant. We've been an isolationist country in the tradition of George Washington. This would be our first foray into foreign intervention, and we're going to have to prime that pump. So we learned that through the yellow press, our government propagandized the American people, always casting the Spanish as the bad guy in the in the scenario. We manufactured evidence in the form of a letter from the Spanish ambassador, which raised the jingoistic ire of the American people. And then we conducted a false flag whereby we sent an American ship with American sailors into harm's way, blew it up ourselves, killed about 255 sailors, and blamed it on Spain. By that point, the pump has been primed. We end up in a Spanish-American War, which was followed up by the Filipino insurrection, which then yields us, because we come out the winner, with all these goodies. Yes, uh, we didn't conquer Cuba in the sense that we conquered or took Hawaii, but we have jurisdiction over Cuba now. Our sugar companies are free to grow their sugar cane, and we put a military base on Guantanamo so that we could oversee our new sphere of influence in Latin America. We got the Philippines, and on which we put a military base in the Philippines to oversee our new outreach into the Far East, specifically China. We got Guam, we got Wake Island, we got Puerto Rico. And we came out of that, quote, splendid little war with the idea, boy, this worked out so well for us. Uh, we might do this again. And this is where the American people have a decision. Line in the sand is drawn. The Democrat Party nominates William Jennings Bryan, and his position on imperialism is it's hypocritical. America didn't like being Britain's colony. Why now are we making other countries our colonies? It violates the traditions, but it also violates the norms and and the intent of our founding fathers, the intent of the American experiment to begin with. And so vote for William Jennings Bryan, the Democrats in the 1900 election would we vote to go back to the way things used to be, right? Well, on the flip side, you have the Republican Party nominate William McKinley and his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt. They're the ones who conducted the Spanish-American War. And even though Teddy's going to prove to be a very progressive president later, when he does become president here at home, he is a foreign interventionist extraordinaire on the as far as imperialism is concerned. And the American people have a choice. We're going to go forward with this imperialism, or we're going to go backwards to isolationism. Which way are we going to go? And of course, it wasn't even a close election. McKinley and Roosevelt won in a landslide. So now these power elites feel emboldened. They realize the American people have spoken. We have a mandate to continue to do what we did. And of course, this is, as we indicated, the point at which the American people or these power elites first committed treason against the American people. Up to this point, their actions had been very treacherous. They constantly exploited American people, took advantage of them. They constantly exploited indigenous peoples in other countries. They constantly exploited everybody in the pursuit of profits. They didn't care about the public interest. They were not noble people, so to speak. They didn't have altruistic motives about what they were trying to do. They were just trying to get rich and grow their companies. But now all of a sudden, in the pursuit of that, they commit treason against the American people by lying to the American people, deceiving the American people, betraying the American people into a war where American people died. That's treason. But they got away with it. They immunized themselves. They got away with it. In the election in 1900 put the stamp of approval on these activities. And so now they feel, as I said, emboldened to go forward. That brings us into the next era, the first European War. Now, what we've seen so far is after the Civil War, these folks were either called, as I indicated earlier, captains of industry or robber barons, depending on your perspective. By the time we get to the Spanish-American War, we're looking at them as the power elites, right? Uh, Creating this overseas empire and controlling the government in the sense that they did. In the European War #1, which turns into World War I, they're called the best and brightest because these are the ones that are going to realize that this European war could put at risk or jeopardize all the assets and these spheres of influence that they've worked so hard to create. This American empire is at risk. And the only way to protect that is to get into the war. Now, it started off as a European war, but slowly we got dragged into it. And it's my contention that it was uh, that was intentional. We wanted to be in it. First, to protect our assets and our spheres of influence during the war, but also after the war in the peace conference. We needed a seat at the table. And so we engaged with our chief ally, Britain, to run a scam on the American people, similar to the one that the American government ran on the American people during the lead up to the Spanish-American War. We used the same methods, propaganda. It was, in this case, the British cut the transatlantic cable, so all the news came filtered through Britain. And again, the boogeyman in this case was Germany, just like the boogeyman in the Spanish-American War was Spain. You always have to create a boogeyman. That's what the propaganda does. And then the manufacture of a letter, actually, it's called the Zimmerman Notes, never been produced, which aroused the fury of the American people to see that Germany was plotting with our neighbor to the south, Mexico, to fight us and take Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, California back as spoils of the war. And so the same situation where the forces that want to get into this war are priming the pump again. And then eventually the false flag, the sending of the Lusitania under a neutral country's flag, ours, the United States flag, full of contraband, full of American citizens, into harm's way. The Germans had promised to sink any ship leaving England or coming to England, and that's exactly what they did. And a bunch of Americans died. It was a big scandal, and the American people, furious by this point, give Wilson the permission to engage in this war. So what's the outcome? World War One. Whereas the Spanish-American War was about creating an overseas empire, World War One is about protecting the overseas empire that we've just done created. Doesn't make any sense to invest in all that and then just watch it all fall away. And this is the first time that we now have private sector power elites being invited into the government to help run the war effort. In other words, they're not on the outside looking in anymore. They're not exerting influence through campaign donations. They are now inside the government with their hands on the levers of power. And they didn't go in by power or take it by force. They were invited by Woodrow Wilson because they were the, quote, best and brightest. So now, of course, they bring with them their Ultra Vires operating principle, which again means we're going to maximize benefit or profits. It doesn't matter what the public interest is. We're going to do what we have to do to maximize the benefit to us and, or in this case, to the United States, and we're going to immunize ourselves afterwards. And what we discover in the afterglow of World War One, when the United States emerges small like a rose, as the most powerful nation on earth, where the financial capital of the world shifts from London to New York City, where all of these companies in America that had to outfit our allies and us, feed our allies and us, realize, boy, there's a lot of money to be made in war, and it becomes a whole new business model. We had a Nye committee in the Senate that examined all this, and they looked at the profits that these companies made. And of course, these companies are owned by these same best and brightest, these same folks that are carrying out the war effort. They're also simultaneously running the companies that are profiting the most from the war effort. And so they were called merchants of death, profiteers, et cetera, et cetera. They don't care that as long as they make money. And one of the decisions that they made coming out of that was the next time we have a war like this, we don't need to end it. And we were only in that war for a year and a half. Now, we outfitted and supported Britain in the lead up to before that, but it was too short. And there's a lot of money to be made if we could stay on a war footing or have the war last longer or create the boogeyman for the next war so we have to stay on a war footing permanently. And then we can continue to make money in our domestic industries, but now also make money in this new war industry. And because we're the ones who did it so successfully in World War One, we'll probably be invited back into government to help make all these decisions, and 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 so we'll have our hands on the levers of power going forward while we're making all this money. It's a whole new business model, is my point. So that was the World War One era, and the paradox of our first real, you know, we had three progressive presidents in a row. We had Teddy, we had Taft, and Wilson. Wilson in that cluster was the most progressive. And he had campaigned with this moral diplomacy, which was his version of criticizing his predecessors He says, we're not going to engage in big stick diplomacy like Teddy did. We're not going to use the military to bully our way around the world. We're not going to engage in dollar diplomacy like Taft did by trying to play the role of Santa Claus or sugar daddy and buy off the rest of the world. I'm going to do what's right. That's why I call it moral diplomacy. And he ran a campaign on keeping us out of war. And yet it was Wilson who, once ensconced as president, was informed of the facts of life about this empire he now oversees, and it's his responsibility to protect it. If he doesn't, he'll be impeached. It was him, this guy who was anti-military, anti-expansionist, anti-foreign intervention, anti all these things, who sent the military into Haiti, Mexico, and eventually World War One. It's a paradox. So you have a progressive president not only engaging in these foreign interventions and using the military, something he swore he'd never do, but he also invites something that he abhors, the private sector ultra vires operating principle, the power elites, these big company owners, these robber barons. He invites them into the public sector to help run the war effort. And this is the marriage between private sector and public sector for the first time. And as I said, they were invited in. So, whereas in the Spanish-American War, they were convincing people in the government to do their bidding and using money to buy their allegiance. In World War One, they were invited in to do what they thought was best to engage to run the war effort. And of course, because they're the best and the brightest, they know better than anybody how to do this, how to feed all these people and still feed the American people, feed all these allies, how to outfit and weapon, to equip all of our allies and still equip our army, how to get them across the ocean, transport back and forth, how to do all these things. There's a lot of logistics involved in a foreign war of this magnitude. The Spanish-American War didn't compare logistically to World War One, and these best and brightest knew how to do it. And by inviting them into the halls of power, he's inviting in also ultra vires. And there is a merging of these private sector and the public sector, which for the first time, the American people don't have a voice. They, in the past, as long as the private sector or the public sector was independent of the private sector, ultra vires was operating in the private sector, the American people understood what the game was. They would always be exploited by these power elites because that's what they do. But you would always have government to take up your cause. They would be your voice because they weren't operating under this maximizing profits, public interest be damned mindset. But now they are. And so World War One is a big turning point. And then you have the interwar years. And the interwar years is when you see the collaboration of these power elites with our future enemy in order to expand the overseas empire. Brown Brothers Harriman, the investment banking firm out of New York City, uh, led by somebody named Prescott Bush, the head of a future political dynasty in America, helps rebuild Germany, funneling all this cash from all these big corporate owners here in America, these big corporations. Here's a few I've listed, into Germany during the interwar years to rebuild it after World War One and to finance Hitler's rise to power. And of course, the excuse given was we've got to rebuild Germany and make it big and strong so it could be a buffer to Soviet communism and the expansion of Soviet communism. Better them be the buffer since they're the neighbor of the Soviet Union than us, or to Russia than to us. And so that was the excuse, the rationalization, but really it was about making money. And so we financed our companies, American companies, these uh, these best and brightest who helped fight Germany in World War One and now rebuilding Germany and financing Hitler's rise to power. And he's a fascist. But as we're going to find going forward, many of these company owners are just as fascist as he is. They don't see a problem with Hitler. A lot of them argued that uh, he was doing a good job, and they agreed with him. And they saw in him a compatriot, somebody they could do business with. They saw in him a partner. And so they began helping Hitler and financing his rise to power. They're violating blatantly the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which was to force Germany to pay the reparations, which under Hitler they stopped paying, and to keep its disarm its military. And part of the financing of Hitler's rise to power was rearming Germany. That was how he put everybody back to work. And where's he getting the money? He's getting the money from us, from these private sector power elites that see in Hitler and in Germany another potential sphere of influence we can conquer and make into a business partner, make us much money. And this is the fact that our government allowed this to happen just happened to coincide with three private sector, big corporate type presidents. These are presidents that see things through that perspective. Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, the roaring 20s. There was a lot of money to pump into Germany to refinance or to finance Germany's rise to power and Hitler's rise to power. And our government, through a wink and a nod, allowed it to happen. Why? Because the presidents were from that world. They were not the progressive presidents that we'd just come off of who might have resisted that. These were presidents from that world. Coolidge famously said the business of America is business. It's about making money. So they had now, you see the progression in the Spanish-American War. These power elites influenced government from afar and through campaign donations from outside the government tent looking in. In World War I, they were invited in and they had their hands on the levers of power. In the interwar years, it was their guy who was president. So now they've made it all the way to the White House. So from the time that these power elites first burst on the scene as these robber barons slash captains of industry after the Civil War, they've made it all the way through an election in 1900 where the American people put their stamp of approval on their activities, and now they're in the White House. They're running the show. And as president of the United States, even in this era, you are the most powerful man on earth because you represent the most powerful nation on earth. So the power elites and this collaboration, these American companies with our future enemy, these fascist countries like Germany, like Italy, you're talking about a marriage of convenience to make money. And this Ultra Vires doctrine, which used to be exclusively the private sector, is now operating out of the White House. So we are fully integrated now. Private, public, basically just one. They're indistinguishable. They're both operating under the same operating principle, which is maximize profits or benefit to yourself. Don't worry about the public interest and immunize yourself so that there's no liability for you now or in the future. And so that's why Brown Brothers Harriman and guys like Prescott Bush were involved. Their job was to set up all these business relationships between the American companies and the German government, and they did a fantastic job of it. And then we get to the Second European War, and this is where we start to see the modern day deep state. I define the deep state as the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it, because in now what these power elites have learned is that there's more money to be made in war and staying on a war footing than there is during peacetime. All the peacetime industries are lucrative to a degree, and we can maintain those peacetime industries because during the interludes between these wars, consumer demand is going to go back up. And somebody's going to need to make cars, someone's going to need to make refrigerators and vacuum cleaners, things of that nature. But to stay on a war footing, someone's also going to have to make planes and tanks and ships. And we can do both. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. And so, and one of these makes more money than the other. The national security of our country, and I don't have to market this to the American people. All you got to do is tell them this, there's no advertising that's necessary to convince the American people how important national security is. That's first and foremost, right? So we'll just uh, lobby for more money, more money, more money from government contracts, bigger government contracts to always stay one step ahead of the enemy. We always have to propagandize the American people, let them know that there's a boogeyman, a country, an enemy out there that's just waiting for us to show a sign of weakness. And so we have to stay strong. We have to stay on a war footing, continue to make all this money, uh, feeding this national security apparatus, this beast that we've created. And of course, that's necessary to protect the empire that we've created. It's far flung, spread out all over the world. And that's when this deep state really takes on a life of its own and starts to be what Eisenhower later calls it the military industrial slash congressional complex, and how it is the tail wagging the dog. All of this, basically every decision in Washington flows first from this national security these priorities of the national security apparatus. Everything else is incidental. First and foremost is national security. And so same calculation is made. It's a European war rerun. And just like in the lead up to our involvement in World War One, the Europeans were fighting each other for years before we got involved. Well, we're having the same situation again. The Europeans are fighting each other again, and there's this long, drawn out drama about whether the United States is going to join or when it's going to join. And of course, the British cut the transatlantic cable again, so that we're getting straight propaganda, news filtered through England to us. And of course, they want nothing more than to get the United States into the war on their side. So we're getting, whether you call it yellow press or propaganda, it's one and the same. And whether it's accomplished by our newspapers or British newspapers, it's one and the same. The result is a propagandization, a propaganda, a propagandization of the American people. And just like in World War I, it's coming from the British side. And the Germans are being cast as the enemy in this situation because of what they're doing to our chief ally, Britain. And but then meanwhile, but FDR and our powers that be are trying to figure out how are we going to get into this war. The American people don't support it. After World War I, the American people are a little bit wise to what happened and all the profiteering that took place and these merchants of death, how they made a lot of money on blood money at the hands of as a result of a lot of people dying. And there's a movement in America, this America First movement, this America First Committee, Charles Lindbergh, people like that who are saying, don't fall for it again, Americans. Don't fall for it. They're going to try to goad us into this war. So it's going to be quite an effort to prime the pump this time. But nevertheless, it's going to have to happen because Britain's going to need our help. They can't fight by themselves forever. We'll try to help them as we can. We'll give them cash and carry weapons and things, ships that they need. When they run out of cash, we'll convert it to lend lease. But at some point, they're going to need our actual help. They can't fight by themselves. So the propaganda machine kicks into gear. And what we realize is that we have another enemy in the Far East that's threatening our sphere of influence in China. And though Germany's probably not ever going to attack us because they learned a lesson from World War I, Japan might. And since Japan and Germany and Italy are all allied together, pretty convenient, right? Germany knew that in the future it was going to invade Russia. And so Japan would be a convenient ally in their war against Russia. Japan knew it was going to have to deal with the Americans, and it would be a convenient ally to have Germany on their side to force America to have to fight a two-front war. So for reasons of strategy and tactics, etc., you have this Axis alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan. And so if we can play possum with the Japanese and not let them know that we've intercepted their code or we've broken their code. We have code breaking machines that are in real time spitting out documents of everything that they're saying, they're planning, what's going on in their meetings. We literally are sitting in their meetings. We know every move they're going to make. And we know about Pearl Harbor is in the same moment that they start planning Pearl Harbor, right? Um, but if we can play possum, let them know, let them think that we're dumb, that we aren't wise to what they're doing, maybe they'll attack us. And on the night before they attack us, we'll make sure and sail our aircraft carriers out to sea to save the ship that's going to matter in the war against the Japanese. We'll sacrifice the others. We'll go through the ruse of meeting with their diplomats at the White House on the morning of December 7th. Um, we'll, all these things to keep them thinking that we aren't aware of what's going on. We'll walk them right into essentially what is another false flag. And instead of sending a ship into harm's way, we're putting a base in harm's way, and we're doing it intentionally. And we're playing along. We're uh, we're playing like we don't know they have a shallow water torpedo. We're playing like we don't know that, that their ships are coming, their planes are coming. Our sonar and our radar thought they were birds. We're playing along with their diplomacy, their fake diplomacy at the White House. We're playing along with the Sunday morning ruse, right? Uh, we're playing along that we haven't broken their code. Uh, and then when they get there and they attack us and they realize our aircraft carriers are out to sea, they'll know then that we knew the attack was coming, but by then it's too late. And now we have what we need. We have an excuse to take to the American people. Everybody's furious about being this unprovoked attack, right? And so now we have a choice to make. We can go to war with Japan, which means that we're going to war with Italy and Japan, or Germany too, because they're allies. And that being the case, we can pick and choose our first enemy. And the first decision we make after December 7th, 1941, besides declaring war, is to choose to fight Germany first. Why? To protect all those business interests we built up during the interwar years. Germany is on the verge of defeating Britain, and we might lose all those. Who are they going to turn? That's our chief ally. Uh, we might be next. And then if we end up with at war with Germany after Britain's been defeated, by that point, uh, you know, we can't control what happens to those assets that we've created over there. We can't control what happens to those business relationships. We can't control any of that. Well, they are now our enemy. In fact, it might get out that we did business with them. We helped finance Hitler's rise to power. All of that needs to be protected. All of that needs to be covered up. And so we chose the Europe first strategy so we would be in prime position to affect the outcome of the European war, and chose to put off for later the fight against the Japanese. So for about 4 or 5 different reasons, it's pretty clear that we laid Pearl Harbor out like a big juicy piece of bait, and the Japanese took it. And it ends up being these exact same methods that we got into Spanish-American War or World War I. We did the same thing in World War II. We just repeated the same method. Propaganda. The British cut the transatlantic cable like they did in World War I. All the information we got about Europe and from Europe was filtered through Britain with our cooperation, our collusion, I believe. The suppression of evidence instead of the manufacture of evidence. We could not let the Japanese ever know that we broke our code. We could not let the Japanese know that we were inside their meeting rooms and knew every move they were fixing to make. We had to play dumb. We had to play possum to lure them into this attack. And they walked right into it. And one of the ways that we kept priming their pump was we kept adding more and more raw materials to the embargo. First it was oil, and then we added all these other things, and we backed them into a corner. They had no choice. And that was the purpose. And then the false flag was the attack itself, which now we can go to the American people and say, hey, look at this. Look what they did. We need a declaration of war. And you saw the vote in Congress. It was 388 to 1. So then you end up in World War II. And again, in a rerun of World War I, FDR, our most progressive president we've ever had, invites the best and brightest back into the government to help run the war effort. And this is a rerun of the World War One uh, procedure. And of course, with them comes ultra vires. And this is where you start to see, now they weren't called deep state then. That's been more of a recent term. But looking back, you can see that's what it was. And that's when it became the deep state as we now know it. And of course, during this World War II um, lead up, when Brown Brothers Harriman was investing all these companies' money into to Germany and to Hitler's rise to power, now it becomes incumbent upon another American entity, this time Sullivan and Cromwell, and this time John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, lawyers, and James Jesus Angleton, lawyers and intelligence assets for the United States government, wearing two hats to do the following. First, to stoke the next war. Remember now, the war is the new business model. And while we're engaged in World War II making all this money and simultaneously aiding and abetting the enemy so that the war goes on longer, but it's all about money, we need to cover that up. We need to hide the identities of these big business collaborators who financed Hitler's rise to power. That was Sullivan and Cromwell's job. That was the Dulles brothers' job. That was Angleton's job. And then at the same time, when all the fighting on the ground could potentially damage the assets of these big companies that have been built up over these interwar years and during the war, we need to protect those assets. We need to protect these business relationships. And and in doing so, it might require the immunization of Nazi assets who have within their power the capability to destroy those assets or protect them. If we immunize them and protect them from war crimes tribunals, they'll help us protect those assets. And so we send over the Dulles, send over Alan Dulles, who's the acting chief of intelligence, our Swiss director of intelligence for the OSS, and he strategically works out a secret surrender with the Nazis in Italy to protect a bunch of these assets, these companies, and etc. We talked about that. And at the same time, immunizes them from ever being brought to trial at Nuremberg. Now, this is in direct contradiction to the orders of his commander in chief, FDR, who says, we're not going to negotiate any secret surrenders with these Nazis. We're only going to accept full and unconditional surrender. And number two, all of these war criminals are going to be brought to justice at Nuremberg. But they weren't. And this is treason. This is out and out treason. So there was treason committed to get us into the war. And now there's treason being committed during the war, especially towards the end, to, again, protect the assets, the business relationships of these big company owners back home. So Dulles is wearing two hats. On one hat, he's the intelligence director for the OSS, supposedly carrying out the wishes of his commander in chief. Find out he's not. Why? Because he's got another hat. When he takes that one hat off of the OSS director of intelligence, he puts the other hat on when he's his Sullivan Cromwell lawyer, and now he's representing his clients. And he's making all these sweetheart deals, and he's keeping people out of war crimes tribunals. And why? Because in this next war that he has already stoked between the United States and the Soviet Union going forward, this new Cold War between these ideologies, democracy and communism, capitalism and communism, we're going to have to stay on this war footing, and we need intelligence. And who better to give us this intelligence than these Nazis? They know more about the Russians than we'll ever know. So he's maximizing the benefit. Public interest doesn't matter. Justice doesn't matter. We'll lie to the American people. We'll propagandize the American people, tell them what they want to hear, feed them some people low on the priority scale, and make some sacrificial lambs or examples out of these Nazis that serve no purpose going forward. But the ones that can help us, we're going to save them. And so again, now you're starting to see ultra vires operating as government policy, because you know you know politicians equals policy, and not that he's a politician, but he's a government. He's inside the government operating as an agency head, and so he's creating policy, and he's using his ultra vires mindset, which he learned in the private sector, but now has been invited in and is part of the public sector. He's using every decision is being filtered through Ultra Vires. How do I maximize the benefit here? Doesn't matter about right or wrong. It doesn't matter about public interest. How do I maximize benefit to me and my cause, or to my clients? If it means a secret surrender, so be it. If it means immunizing war criminals from Nuremberg, so be it. If it means uh, disobeying the orders of the commander-in-chief, committing treason, so be it. Do what's necessary. And of course, we're going to see in the post-war era, all these people that committed these acts of treason get rewarded. They get promoted. They get these new positions higher up in the government to continue their actions going forward. So uh, uh, that brings us to the paradox of FDR. Now, he ends up being our most progressive president. The paradox is that in 1933, there's no question, in his own words, FDR recognized the problem. He said in his own book, quote, if the concentration of wealth and power goes on at its present rate, by the end of the 20th century, we shall have all of America's industry and finance controlled by less than a dozen major corporations. They are owned and run by less than 100 men today. Putting it plainly, we are on and are still steering a steady course toward economic and political oligarchy. Okay, so he put it pretty well there. And then in his convention speech 3 years later at the DNC convention, he says, quote, it was entirely natural to expect that the privileged princes of the new corporate economic dynasties, thirsting for power and profit as they are, would reach out and seek control over the government itself. They have created a new despotism and have wrapped it in the robes of legal sanctions. What he's saying is these power elites, these what we're now calling the deep state, have become integrated within the government, and they are constantly seeking control over the government itself. Now, this is 36. When we get into the war, we don't get into the war till 41, 5 years later, and we see Alan Dulles, for example, one of these uh, privileged princes, uh, actually carrying out and making his own foreign policy. So it's not that he's seeking control over the government; he has control over the government in that case. And now, it's interesting that he's saying this in 1936. What you don't know, but what I'm going to tell the next two episodes, the story of the business plot, which happened in 34 and 35, and 36 is right after that. So there is he has a personal experience with this where uh, prominent businessmen in the United States tried to overthrow FDR and came really close to achieving it. And of course, he finds out about it after the fact, and it alarms him how close they came to succeeding. And so in 36, he's given a speech about how they're thirsting for power and profit as they are. And why are we surprised when they, because of this ambition, why are we surprised that they would ever reach out and seek control over the government itself? And they have created a new despotism, have wrapped it in the robes of legal sanctions. When you control the legislature, which makes the law, when you control the judicial system, which interprets the law, when you control the executive, which enforces the law, then anything's legal. You immunize yourself because all the law has been written by you. It's being upheld by you. It's being enforced by you. The law is what you say it is. And so, legally speaking, that their actions are sanctioned. That's what he's saying. We have got to guard. This is FDR's warning, similar to Eisenhower's warning in his farewell address. He says we must guard against this acquisition of power by these unelected, unaccountable elites who form this military-industrial congressional complex. Uh, we must guard against the tail wagging the dog. They're unaccountable, they're unelected. In a way, FDR in 36 is saying the same thing. He's saying exactly the same thing. So we have presidents who are recognizing where this is heading, and it's not in a direction that our founding fathers ever intended. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's pretty clear this direction is, as he said earlier in his book, a a, a small oligarchy which is exercising power politically and economically over the people, over the nation, over the country, over over all the economic and political power. They're controlling everything. And uh, so this what he called oligarchy and despotism. Here we have FDR, arguably our most progressive president, especially here at home. No one compares to the New Deal, right? That's about as progressive as you can get. Here he is railing against the privileged princes and the economic dynasties, and yet it was him, and it was on his watch, and it was at his invitation and his appointment power that the collaborators of the interwar years, that the power elites of the Spanish-American War and the best and brightest of the World War I era, all of these, whatever title you want to give them, we call them deep state now. He invites them in to become these deep state operators running the war effort, i.e., running the government, especially as he gets older. You know, as he gets towards the tail end of World War II, in the thick of his fourth presidency, his fourth term, he gets sick and basically infirm. And these folks, the powers behind the throne, are essentially running the throne at that point. And remember now, the deep state is, as I define it, the national security apparatus and the industries that feed it. When they're coming to power, when they're bursting onto the scene as the powers behind the throne, it's during the times when they were promoted the most was during times of war. World War One integrated them into the government. World War II, they become the government. And it's these two wars of quote existential crisis. That's how it was propagandized to the American people. Really, World War One is about saving the empire or protecting the empire that they created in the Spanish-American War, and in World War II is about expanding it. Eisenhower later came to call it the military-industrial congressional complex. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. FDR's term for it was oligarchy, despots. Eisenhower called it military industrial congressional complex. We call it the deep state. It's the same thing. And they cloak themselves as the protectors of our national security so that they can continue to make all this money, keeping us on this war footing or keeping us in war constantly because it's the most lucrative business model that's ever been created. And so the paradox is that this deep state, these oligarchs, these unaccountable, unelected, this unaccountable, unelected shadow government merged the private and public sector together as one, brought with them ultra vires, and now both entities, private and public, are operating under this maximization of profits, public interest be damned, immunity for all. They don't they have a term for it. They don't call it immunity. Just that's a general term. With respect to the government, it's now called sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity means government is protected from ever being sued or held liable without its consent. In other words, government has to give a plaintiff permission to sue it or to seek redress in a court of law. And it's rooted in the principle that, quote, the king can do no wrong. So here's the danger. You know, the government for certain activities, there's a case to be made where sovereign immunity is legitimate. Okay. But now when you bring the private sector into under that same tent, this is how you have pharmaceuticals being exempt from ever being held liable for any of its products causing damage or harm to patients or to regular people, right? This is how you have private industries that are so integrated within the government being exempt from any liability. It's sovereign immunity. They had a form of immunity when they were private sector operating under ultra vires. And that was all manipulated by their own actions, right? They had to create the holding companies. They had to create the subsidiaries, the shell companies. They had to play this game to hide their assets, to hide their income. They don't have to play any games anymore. Their incomes, the money they make from their products is right out there for everybody to see. But because their main customer is the United States government, because their partner is the United States government, they have what's called sovereign immunity, and they can basically do anything they want out front, in front of everybody, and nobody can do anything about it. They have sovereign immunity. It's a whole new level of immunity. Why are we surprised when they exploit that? Why are we surprised when they take advantage of that? And and you know, they have nothing to check and balance them. Nothing. So now the private sector, this deep state as we call it, has access to all the levels of power, executive, legislative, and judicial, which they had starting off because they had money to pay these people. Now they're inside. They're operating these a lot of these politicians that run for office are recruited by these industries because they're from that industry and they want somebody. It's basically a bought and paid for lobbyist at the behest of whatever industry to go to Washington on their behalf. So they control the executive, which enforces the law. They control the legislative, which makes the law. They control the judicial, which interprets the law. They are the law. And as such, they control all the foreign and domestic policy, right? They control it all because they are the law. They make the law. They set the agendas. And their ultimate leverage instrument, the hammer to enforce whatever it is they want, is the U.S. military. And I gave you that quote from the U.S. Marine Corps Commandant Major General Smedley Butler. We're going to be talking a lot about Smedley Butler the next 2 days. But he recognized it. This is back at the turn of the century. And he said, my God, I spent 33 years in active military service. And during that time, I spent most of my time as a high class muscle man for American big business. I'm a Marine. I'm a United States Marine general, but I'm working for American big business, for Wall Street and for their bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. You don't get any more leverage if you're a private sector corporate owner, than the United States military, where you can pick up the phone, call Washington, and say, send the Marines in there, send the Marines in over here, send the Navy there, and they'll do it. It really calls into question all the wars that we've been fighting. Every time we go to the Middle East, how many times we've been in Iraq? Twice in the last, couple decades. Every time we fight these wars, it really calls into question uh, what our motives are. I know what we're told, but it's the same thing people during World War One era were told. Oh, the Germans, the Huns are coming to get us. They're going to brutalize our women, rape our women, and kill our children. Same thing, World War Two. The Nazis are coming. The Japanese are coming. And we find out later we're in the building of this empire, Spanish-American War. We now have to protect it. And in the rebuilding of Germany after World War II, we now have to protect all those assets. And yeah, Hitler's a bad guy, but he's not that bad. He's not as bad as Stalin. He's our bad guy. And, uh, you know, he was our partner for a period of time. And anyway, you find out there's a lot of nuance that history books don't tell you. There's a lot of money being made by these deep staters that turn out are sort of the the motives behind why we fight these wars, to protect that money flow, protect that power. All right, so these we've now come through. We now have a new term as a result of World War II. We know what it's called. It's called the deep state, and this deep state is going to have a problem with FDR, even though he's giving them what they want. On the foreign, it's kind of like Wilson. Wilson gave these power elites what they wanted as far as foreign intervention is concerned, World War One. Haiti, Mexico. But domestically, he kind of did what he wanted. We spin it ahead to FDR. He's trying to do what Wilson did, operate as a progressive here at home, but save our empire abroad. So he's trying to basically employ the same strategy as Wilson. But now these deep staters have more power than they've ever had, and they don't want to give him even the progressive reforms here at home. They think he's gone too far. And so they're going to try to do something about it. Remember now, we started off this series defining treason as the overthrow of a government, the betrayal of a country, which results in the overthrow of a government or the killing of the assassination or killing of the head of state, the king, in this case, the president, or it ends up overthrowing his government. That's treason. Or where you betray your people into a war where Americans die. That's treason. We've already seen treason in the Spanish-American War. We saw that got us into that war. We saw treason that got us into World War I. We saw treason that got us into World War II. We saw treason at the hands of Allen Dulles when he was insubordinate to his commander in chief, and he negotiated a secret surrender with the Nazis in Italy. We saw treason when he was insubordinate and he granted immunity to war criminals. But that was abroad. We're going to see treason here at home. This whole plot to overthrow FDR. That's going to be the subject of our next 2 episodes. All right. Thank you for joining. And I hope you enjoyed that. Feel free to subscribe to my channel, smash the like button. Also, feel free to share and comment. Thank you. Have a good day. God bless.